Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone. As John said, I work for Element Energy. We're a small low-carbon energy and engineering consultancy. We work across the whole low-carbon space, from power generation through to transport and the built environment. And within transport, which is what I'm here to talk about today, we work from initial technology and market assessment, for example, on things like the River Simple car. We work on policy. That's a report we did for the Energy Saving Trust. And we also work on the current study for the LowCVP that I'm going to talk to you about today. And we work through to the end stage, which is implementation and management. That picture there is of my colleague Kate Harland, who's been seconded to DEC for the last year, running their hydrogen bus program. So earlier in the year, the Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership commissioned Element to conduct a study on the total cost of ownership for low carbon vehicles in the period to 2020, from 2020 to 2030. The rationale for that is that, as we all know, the capital cost of low carbon vehicles is often higher than the incumbent, but they're also characterised by lower running costs over their life. So we expect that vehicles will be marketed more and more on total cost of ownership as they are in fleets, rather than on simple capital cost basis. So the objectives of the study were to identify how future vehicle drivetrains will compare in the longer term on a total cost of ownership basis, to look at what would have to change in terms of technology, cost and performance in order for low carbon vehicles to be a compelling alternative when measured on a TCO basis, and then look at policies that could be implemented to close that gap if there is a gap remaining in the 2020 decade. The work we've done has mainly focused on incremental improvements, looking at historical trends in fuel economy and things like that, but we also look at the effect of disruptive events, such as radical changes in battery or fuel cell prices, oil price spikes and things like that. And then finally, which this ties in with some other work that's been done for the LowCVP recently, looking at the lifetime cost of CO2 abatement of these different powertrains after 2020, using a whole life cycle approach. So the methodology for the study has been quite complex, and we've made a lot of assumptions on how the market's going to develop over the next 2 decades. All of the detailed methodology and assumptions will be contained in a report that's being issued in the next few weeks, but I just wanted to cover a few of the key inputs today. These inputs have been reviewed over a couple of stages by the LowCVP steering group and by the wider membership, so probably worth saying thank you very much to anyone who's been involved in that process over the last few months. So we build a capital cost model for a variety of low carbon powertrains using the components that you see on the slide there. We look at margins in the industry at the moment to calculate current production costs of vehicles based on selling prices of average vehicles. We then look at the costs of primary and secondary power plants, electric motors and internal combustion engines, taking into account historical trends, for example on power to weight ratios and absolute power of vehicles. Major components like batteries and fuel cells and hydrogen tanks are included, as well as the remaining components of the powertrain. And finally, we look at improvements that will happen in all powertrains, such as the reduction in non-drivetrain mass over the next 2 decades. The trend in that has been relatively flat for the last decade, and we expect that finally to change in the next 10 years, and we'll see an absolute reduction in vehicle mass in the order of about 20% by 2020, and that's carried through all of the powertrains that we're investigating here. So a couple of the major components of low carbon vehicles. The first is obviously the battery costs. We've based the input assumptions on major publications that you see there, and it's quite a steep reduction in battery costs from about $1,000 per kilowatt hour now down to about $300 per kilowatt hour in 2030. I think that's very much in keeping with what's in the literature. These are costs for the pack rather than at the cell level. And it's also worth noting that those are well above some of the other targets that are published on what batteries need to be rather than projections on what they can be. For example, the US Advanced Battery Consortium has a target for passenger cars of $100 per kilowatt hour. So we're well above that. We do look in the report at the effect of meeting those targets on the cost of these vehicles. We have made similar assumptions for the cost of fuel cell systems. The reduction there is much, much steeper because you're starting from very low volumes at the moment in the hundreds of pounds per kilowatt for the fuel cell systems. Those are assumed to come down to about £75 a kilowatt by 2020 and then about £50 per kilowatt by 2030. And it's just worth noting here that is highly volume dependent. The cost reductions for fuel cells, it's about mass production rather than pure materials costs, which tend to influence the cost of batteries. So as you can see at the top there, we're assuming that you're into the hundreds of thousands of fuel cell systems per fuel cell OEM by those dates in order to bring those costs down. So bringing that all together, this slide shows the capital cost, not TCO, the capital cost for vehicles in 2020, showing each of the major components there. And as you can see, I don't think it's a particularly surprising result that the internal combustion engine is still the cheapest in 2020 on a capital cost basis. And you see on the right-hand side increasing costs through non-plug-in hybrid to a plug-in hybrid and a REEV through to the highest cost technologies, which are the pure EV and the hydrogen vehicles. And on the bottom here, I've shown the electric range, which is obviously a very important factor in battery requirements. We've assumed that electric vehicle range in pure EVs will rise slightly over the next 10 years because there is a utility, as a usefulness of those extra miles to consumers. But we've assumed that for the plug-in hybrid and the REEV, manufacturers choose to keep range constant and reduce the battery cost as much as possible. So that's the 2020 results. In 2030, you see further reductions and you see a narrowing of that gap across all the powertrains, so that on a capital cost basis, you have a price premium of about £3,000 to a plug-in hybrid vehicle and then nearer £5,000 to an electric vehicle. And the EV range, to be clear, that has now risen to 240 kilometres. So that's only a 50% reduction on current vehicles, the new generation of electric vehicles. We're not suggesting that you're chasing a range of 500 or more kilometres, because the battery costs just don't support that. So that's capital cost. We've also quantified the running costs for the other components of the TCO. This is about the effect of electric range on tailpipe emissions. We have used data from the National Travel Survey to quantify the proportion of annual driving distance that can be carried out using electricity as a function of electric range, based on the number of trips people do and the distance per trip. And that varies by electric range, and as you can see on the left-hand panel there, we have made two scenarios. One, an optimistic scenario, assuming that people can recharge at the end of each trip so that they are able to get away and back with a charge in between, and then a more pessimistic assumption where effectively you're limited, your driving radius is actually half the electric range of the car because you can't charge further away. And as you can see, that approach gives results for tailpipe emissions that are broadly similar to current vehicle standards calculated over the NEDC. The right-hand panel there shows the effect of increasing the electric range on the cost of fuel and electricity. And as you can see, as you increase the vehicle range from about 20 kilometres to 40 kilometres, you increase the proportion of electricity making up your annual fuel cost, and you also reduce the total cost. It's also worth saying that because of improvements to the internal combustion engine over the next 10 years, that fuel cost saving is smaller in 2020 or 2030 than it is now. Your incumbent vehicle is using less fuel, which reduces some of the benefit of plug-in powertrain.